April 17, 1945, Bückeburg, Lower Saxony. As dusk fell over the crumbling edges of the once proud German town, 22-year-old Margarete Schulz stood nervously at her bedroom window, watching American military vehicles roll down the cobblestone street. The war was effectively over in this part of Germany, with Hitler's Reich collapsing day by day, yet the fear that had been drilled into her since childhood remained. Among the arriving soldiers, she noticed men with dark skin, the Schwarze that Nazi propaganda had described as subhuman, even claiming they possessed tails like animals. "Tonight we will see if the stories are true," she whispered to her younger sister Helga, who clutched a worn photograph of their father, missing on the Eastern Front for over a year. Neither sister could have imagined that within hours, their understanding of their defeated nation's ideology would begin to unravel through something as simple as a dance. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one segregated battalion of African-American soldiers stationed in post-war Germany would challenge generations of racist propaganda, not through violence or retribution, but through dignity, kindness, and unexpected cultural exchange, leaving hundreds of German women to question everything they had been told about race, humanity, and their supposed superiority. The 784th Tank Battalion had arrived in Bückeburg as part of the American occupation forces. Unlike many other American units, the 784th was composed entirely of black soldiers, with white officers commanding, a reflection of the still segregated U.S. Army. Staff Sergeant James Wilson, a 26-year-old from Harlem, New York, supervised the securing of municipal buildings while trying to ignore the wary stares from local residents. Having fought his way across France and into Germany, Wilson had become accustomed to being viewed with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension by Europeans, but the reaction of Germans was particularly unsettling. "The way they look at us, like we're some kind of circus exhibition," Wilson remarked to Corporal Henry Jackson as they secured the perimeter of the town hall. "Goebbels really did a number on these folks." Jackson, a former college student from Philadelphia, nodded grimly. "I heard some of them actually believe we have tails. Can you believe that? All that supposed German intellectual superiority, and they think we're part monkey." Wilson shook his head. "Well, orders are to maintain positive relations with civilians. General Davis was clear. We represent not just the army, but all colored folks back home. No incidents, nothing to reinforce their propaganda." Brigadier General Benjamin O. Davis, Sr., the Army's first black general, had personally addressed many of the all-black units deployed to Germany, emphasizing their dual mission: military occupation and tacit diplomacy through their conduct. The 784th took this responsibility seriously, maintaining strict discipline despite the open curiosity and sometimes hostility they encountered. Meanwhile, across town, Margarete Schulz was helping her mother prepare their meager evening meal: a thin potato soup with a few scraps of dried meat. Their spacious family home, once a symbol of upper-middle-class comfort, now housed 3 additional families displaced by Allied bombing. Food shortages had been severe for months, and the arrival of American troops, while frightening, also brought rumors of actual food distribution. "Did you see them, Margarete?" her mother asked quietly, glancing toward the door to ensure none of their housemates were listening. "The Negroes?" Margarete nodded. "They're setting up at the town hall and the school building. Stay away from them," her mother whispered urgently. "You know what we've heard." Margarete didn't respond. At 22, she had gradually begun to question much of what she had been taught. The promised 1,000-year Reich had collapsed in just 12 years, leaving Germany in ruins. Could other things she had been told be equally false? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Her mother froze, clutching the wooden spoon like a weapon. Margarete answered to find an American military officer, white, accompanied by the town's acting burgomaster. "Frau Schulz," the burgomaster addressed her mother. "The Americans are requisitioning a portion of your home for an officer's quarters. You have the most suitable property still standing in this sector." Her mother began to protest, but stopped as the American officer spoke. "Ma'am, I understand this is difficult. Captain Thomas Miller, U.S. Army. I assure you we will respect your property and privacy. You will be compensated with additional rations." The mention of extra food silenced any further objection. Within an hour, Captain Miller had moved into their father's study with minimal disruption. To Margaret's surprise, he was unfailingly polite, even producing a chocolate bar for Helga, who accepted it with wide eyes. That evening, as Margaret helped her mother with mending, Captain Miller entered the kitchen and cleared his throat. "Excuse me, I wanted to inform you that there will be a dance tomorrow evening at the town hall. The mayor agreed it might help normalize relations. Your family is welcome to attend." Margaret's mother stiffened. "Who will be at this dance?" "Military personnel, local officials who have been cleared by our intelligence, and residents. Music, some refreshments." He paused. "All of our troops, including the men of the 784th. "The colored soldiers," her mother said flatly. "Yes, ma'am. Distinguished combat veterans who helped liberate your country from the Nazi regime." His tone remained professional but had taken on an edge. After he left, Margaret's mother forbade both daughters from attending. But something had awakened in Margaret: curiosity, defiance, or perhaps simply a young woman's desire to hear music and forget the war for a few hours. The next morning brought a new development. Sergeant Wilson and a detail of men from the 784th arrived at houses throughout the neighborhood, distributing ration packages and assessing structural damage to buildings. When they reached the Schultz home, Margaret answered the door. Wilson removed his helmet respectfully. "Good morning, ma'am. We're distributing supplemental rations and conducting a structural safety assessment. May we take a look at your roof? We've noted damage from the street." Margaret stood speechless, caught between ingrained fear and the disarmingly professional manner of the soldier before her. She noticed his uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, nothing like the shuffling, animalistic caricatures from propaganda films. And he most certainly did not have a tail. "My mother isn't home," she finally managed. "That's all right, ma'am. We can leave these supplies and come back another time for the inspection." As Wilson's men unloaded a crate containing canned meat, powdered milk, coffee and chocolate, Margaret found her voice again. "Our roof does leak badly when it rains. My father would have fixed it, but he's not here." Something in Wilson's expression softened. "I understand. Perhaps we could take a quick look now, while we're here?" For the next hour, Wilson and two other soldiers patched the worst sections of the damaged roof. Working efficiently and speaking little, they completed repairs that would have taken Margaret weeks to arrange through civilian channels, if materials could be found at all. When they finished, Wilson declined her awkward offer of water with a polite, "No thank you, ma'am. We have supplies." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "There's a gathering at the town hall tonight. Music, some food, might lift spirits around here." After they left, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at the cans of food they delivered. Everything she had been taught about these men contradicted what she had just experienced. They were orderly, respectful, skilled, and undeniably human. Across town, Private First Class Marcus Reynolds sat writing a letter to his wife in Detroit. At just 19, Reynolds was one of the youngest members of the 784th, having joined as soon as he was eligible. His high school education and natural aptitude had earned him a position maintaining the battalion's tanks despite his youth. "Dear Sarah," he wrote, "Germany is nothing like we imagined. These people built this great civilization everyone back home talks about, with their composers and scientists, yet they believed the most backward things about us. Today, a woman actually looked under my jacket when I turned around, like she was checking for a tail. I would have been angry if it wasn't so ridiculous." Reynolds paused, choosing his next words carefully. He didn't want to worry Sarah, but he needed to express the strange mixture of power and restraint he felt. "The strangest part is that we're now the authority here. After all the yes sir, no sir back home, after being barred from restaurants and told to step off sidewalks, we're giving orders and these Germans have to listen. But General Davis reminded us that we're not here for revenge. We're here to show them what they refuse to see, our humanity. There's a dance tonight. Some of the fellows are nervous about how that will go, but Captain Miller says it's important to normalize relations." In another part of town, Helga Schultz had slipped away from her mother's watchful eye to explore the changed atmosphere of occupied Bückeburg. At 16, she possessed all the curiosity of youth, with fewer of the ideological entrenchments of her elders. Near the makeshift American mess hall, she watched as soldiers distributed leftover food to a gathering crowd of German children. Corporal Henry Jackson noticed her hovering at the edge of the group and approached with a packaged K-ration. "Here you go, miss. There's chocolate inside." Helga hesitated, then accepted the package. "Danke," she said softly. "Bitte schön," Jackson replied with a practiced accent. Surprised, Helga asked, "You speak German?" "Just a little. Enough to get by. I studied languages before the war." "You went to university?" Helga couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Jackson's expression remained neutral, though something flickered in his eyes. "Yes, Howard University in Washington. I was studying to become a teacher before all this." This simple statement disrupted everything Helga had been taught about the intellectual capabilities of non-Aryans. Before she could respond, another soldier called Jackson away. Helga remained, watching the distribution of food, noting the orderly conduct of both soldiers and civilians, and particularly observing the black soldiers' interactions with the German children. Gentle, often playful, with none of the brutality she had been warned to expect. By evening, word of the dance had spread throughout Bückeburg. Military authorities had positioned it as a goodwill gesture, but among the townspeople, reactions ranged from outrage to cautious curiosity. For many young women, particularly those who had lost male companions to the war, it represented something else entirely, a brief respite from grief and hardship. At the Schultz home, Margaret made her decision. After her mother retired early with a headache, she changed into her one remaining dress that could be considered suitable for dancing, a blue cotton garment that had belonged to her cousin who had perished in the Dresden bombing. She helped Helga prepare as well, the sisters working in silent complicity. "What about the stories?" Helga finally whispered as Margarete pinned her hair. "I saw them today fixing our roof," Margaret replied. "They're just men, Helga. They don't have tails or horns or any of those things from the films. But Mutti also said the Führer would save Germany." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "I think perhaps we should see for ourselves what is true and what isn't." The town hall had been transformed. American flags hung alongside the local Bückeburg standard, all Nazi symbols having been removed days earlier. A band composed of musicians from the 784th Battalion's own ranks had set up in one corner, playing a mixture of American swing and traditional German folk tunes they had quickly learned. Tables along the walls held refreshments, simple fare by pre-war standards but luxurious amid current scarcity. Captain Miller stood near the entrance with Major Williams, the commanding officer of the 784th, and Burgermeister Hoffmann, greeting arrivals. The atmosphere was tense with uncertainty. A handful of young German women had arrived, standing clustered together near the refreshments, while most of the American soldiers, particularly the black servicemen, maintained a respectful distance. "This might have been a mistake, Williams," Miller muttered. "The cultural divide might be too wide." Major Williams, a distinguished officer from a prominent Washington, D.C. family, shook his head. "Give it time, Tom. Rome wasn't built in a day, and generations of propaganda won't disappear in one evening. But music has a way of bridging gaps." As if on cue, Margarete and Helga Schultz entered the hall. Captain Miller recognized them immediately. "The daughters of the house where I'm billeted," he explained to Williams. "I'm surprised they came. Their mother seemed quite traditional." Margaret scanned the room, noting the division. Americans on one side, Germans on the other, with a no-man's land of empty floor between them. Her eyes met Sergeant Wilson's across the room. He nodded politely, but made no move to approach. The band struck up a Glenn Miller tune. No one moved to dance. The Burgermeister, sweating profusely, whispered urgently to Captain Miller, "This integration idea, perhaps it was premature." What happened next would later be described differently by various witnesses, but all agreed it changed the trajectory of the evening. Helga Schultz, perhaps with the impulsiveness of youth, or simply tired of waiting, walked directly to where Corporal Jackson stood and said clearly enough for those nearby to hear, "You promised to teach me American dancing." Jackson, who had made no such promise, recovered quickly. "So I did," he replied, offering his hand. They stepped onto the empty dance floor. Jackson, moving with natural rhythm, began to demonstrate basic swing steps. Helga, coordinated and a quick learner, followed his lead. For a long moment they danced alone while both Americans and Germans watched in stunned silence. Then, slowly, the ice began to thaw. Private Reynolds approached a group of German girls and, using the few German phrases he had mastered, invited one to dance. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted. Others followed, some American soldiers, some brave German women making the first move. Margareta remained at the edge of the room, watching this unexpected integration with fascination. She noticed Sergeant Wilson standing alone near a window, observing rather than participating. "You're not dancing, Sergeant?" she asked, approaching him. Wilson turned, surprised. "I'm on duty, ma'am. Someone has to keep an eye on things. I saw you today, fixing our roof. Thank you for that." He nodded acknowledgement. "Just doing my job." "Is dancing part of your job too?" she asked with unexpected boldness. A hint of a smile crossed his face. "I suppose maintaining positive community relations could include dancing." As they stepped onto the floor, Margaret was conscious of eyes following them, her neighbors, other soldiers. The weight of social transgression hung in the air, yet as Wilson guided her expertly through the steps of a foxtrot, something else emerged, the simple human connection of two people moving in harmony to music. "You dance very well," she remarked, surprised. "Harlem has some of the best dance halls in New York," he replied. "I spent many weekends at the Savoy before the war." The conversation that followed unfolded naturally, about music, about life before the war, about home. Wilson spoke of Harlem's vibrant culture, his family's small apartment, his mother's work as a seamstress, his own pre-war job at the post office. Margaret described Bückeburg before bombs fell, her studies interrupted by war, her father's small accounting practice. Neither mentioned politics or ideology, neither spoke of propaganda or prejudice. Instead, they discovered the universal commonalities of human experience, family, work, dreams deferred by global conflict. Across the room, similar conversations were occurring as the evening progressed. Language barriers were navigated with gestures, broken phrases, and the universal language of smiles and nods. The musicians, sensing the changing mood, transitioned to more energetic numbers, demonstrating the Lindy Hop and Jitterbug to fascinated German partners. For many of the young German women, this represented their first direct interaction with Americans, let alone black Americans. For the soldiers of the 784th, it offered a rare opportunity to be seen as individuals, rather than through the lens of racial categorization, an experience as novel in Germany as it would have been in many parts of America. Private Reynolds found himself surrounded by curious German girls asking about American music and dance. Corporal Jackson was deep in conversation with Helga and two of her friends, patiently answering questions about university life in America. Even Major Williams had taken to the floor, dancing formally but skillfully with the Burgermeister's wife. As midnight approached, Captain Miller signaled for the final dance. The band began a slow waltz and couples filled the floor once more. Margaret, who had danced with Wilson for much of the evening, now stood with him near the refreshment table. "I should get my sister home," she said, watching Helga still chatting animatedly with Jackson. Wilson nodded. "Of course, your mother will be worried." "She doesn't know we're here." Margaret paused. She wouldn't have approved. "Because we're Americans? Because you're—" She stopped, suddenly ashamed. "Because I'm black," he finished calmly. "I'm sorry. The things we were taught, they seem so foolish now." Wilson's expression remained composed. Propaganda works by dehumanizing people, making them seem like something other than what they are, just people. That's why nights like this are important. Hard to believe someone has a tail when you've spent hours dancing with them. Margaret flushed with embarrassment. "You heard about that. It's not the strangest thing I've heard. Back home in Georgia, where I was born, some folks believed we had different color blood." He shook his head. "Ignorance is a powerful weapon." As they gathered their things to leave, Sergeant Wilson offered to escort the sisters home, a gesture of both courtesy and practical security in a town under occupation with occasional disorder after dark. They walked through the quiet streets, their conversation continuing in hushed tones that wouldn't disturb the curfew. "Will there be more dances?" Helga asked eagerly. "If tonight is deemed successful," Wilson replied. "It depends on the command's assessment." "It seemed successful to me," Margaret observed. "No incidents, everyone enjoying themselves." "That's because the town's most dedicated Nazi supporters stayed home," Wilson noted. "The real test will be how the community reacts tomorrow." At their doorstep, the parting was brief but cordial. Wilson saluted formally and waited until they were safely inside before continuing his patrol route back to headquarters. Inside, the sisters found their mother awake and waiting, her face a mask of worry and anger. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "I've been frantic." "At the dance," Margaret admitted. "We're fine, Mutti. It was just music and conversation." "With those men," her voice sharpened. "How could you disgrace yourselves? What would your father say?" "Father would want us to survive, to find moments of normalcy," Margaret argued. "The Americans control our town now. We need to adapt." "Not with them," her mother insisted. "Not with the Schwarze." Helga, unusually defiant, spoke up. "They're university-educated, Mutti. They speak multiple languages. Corporal Jackson was studying to be a teacher before the war. And they gave us these," Margaret added, producing chocolate bars Wilson had given them at the dance. "They're helping repair homes, distributing food. They fixed our roof today." Their mother stared at the chocolate, her principles warring with practicality. Finally, she took the candy and placed it on the shelf. "You will not go to any more of these events. The neighbors will talk." "The neighbors were there," Margaret replied quietly. "Frau Müller's daughters, the Weber girl, even Bürgermeister Hoffmann's wife. Everyone is hungry, everyone is tired of suffering, and the Americans have food and music." The standoff ended in an uneasy truce, with neither side conceding but the immediate conflict suspended by exhaustion. As the sisters prepared for bed in their shared room, Helga whispered, "Do you think they'll really have another dance?" "I think so," Margaret replied. "I think it's important to them that we see them as they really are, not as we were told they were." "I checked, you know," Helga confessed with a giggle, when Corporal Jackson wasn't looking. No tail. Margaret laughed softly. "You didn't." "I did. I had to know for sure." Their laughter, the first genuine mirth in their home for months, carried a cathartic release of tension. In that moment, another small piece of indoctrinated prejudice crumbled away. The next morning brought unexpected developments. Captain Miller, over breakfast in the Schultz home, mentioned that military governor's office had approved a community improvement initiative. The 784th Tank Battalion, while maintaining security duties, would assist with infrastructure repairs throughout Bückeburg. "Sergeant Wilson mentioned your roof," Miller explained. "We've identified similar needs throughout the town. It builds goodwill and keeps the men constructively occupied." Frau Schultz listened silently, her resistance undermined by practical necessity. When Miller left, she turned to Margarete. "You danced with this Sergeant Wilson?" "Yes, Mutti. He was a perfect gentleman." Her mother's expression remained troubled. "Times are changing too quickly. Everything we believed was wrong." Margaret finished gently. "The war is over. We lost. Perhaps it's time to question what we were told." Across town, the 784th's commanding officers were conducting their own assessment of the previous night's event. Major Williams, reviewing reports, nodded with satisfaction. "No incidents, positive civilian engagement, and improved morale among the men. I'd call that a success, Captain," Miller agreed. "Surprising how quickly some of those girls overcame their conditioning. I was prepared for much more resistance." "Music and chocolate are powerful diplomats," Williams remarked. "And our men conducted themselves with perfect discipline. I've already reported favorably to headquarters. We're authorized to continue the community engagement program." For the soldiers of the 784th, the dance had represented something profound, recognition of their humanity by people who had been taught to see them as subhuman. Private Reynolds captured this in another letter to his wife. "Last night changed something, Sarah. For a few hours, we weren't just occupiers or even soldiers. We were just men enjoying music with women who had been told we were monsters. I danced with a German girl who admitted she had believed we had tails. By the end of the evening, she was laughing at how foolish that seemed. I keep thinking about how people back home might benefit from the same kind of moment, just seeing each other as people first. The following weeks saw a gradual but significant shift in Bückeburg. As the 784th Tank Battalion participated in reconstruction efforts, relationships formed, tentative friendships, professional respect, and in some cases, deeper connections. Each interaction further eroded the foundation of racial mythology that Nazi propaganda had constructed. Sergeant Wilson became a regular visitor to the Schultz home, initially to oversee repairs, but later as a guest welcomed by even Frau Schultz, whose resistance had softened in the face of his unfailing courtesy and the practical benefits of American protection and supplies. Weekly dances at the town hall became a community fixture, drawing increasingly larger crowds as fear gave way to curiosity and then to genuine enjoyment. By June 1945, when the 784th received orders for redeployment, the transformation was remarkable. The unit that had arrived to suspicious stares and whispered myths now prepared to depart, amid genuine regret from many townspeople. A farewell gathering was organized, with the town's newly established civilian council officially thanking the battalion for its role in Bückeburg's initial recovery. At this event, Margaret found herself seated beside Sergeant Wilson, watching as Germans and Americans shared food, conversation, and music with an ease that would have seemed impossible 2 months earlier. "Your unit is leaving," she stated, having heard the news through Captain Miller. "Yes, we're being redeployed to Bavaria, then likely home," Wilson confirmed. "Things will be different here without you all," she said carefully. "Different how?" "Some of the other American units, they don't mix with us the same way, they keep to themselves." Wilson nodded, understanding her meaning. "White units may have different protocols, different attitudes." "They don't seem to want to dance," she observed with a small smile. "Some might, some won't. People are individuals, not just representatives of their groups. That's true of white Americans, black Americans, Germans, everyone." "That's perhaps the most important lesson of these months," Margaret reflected. "Seeing people as individuals." Wilson was quiet for a moment before responding. "When I return to America, I'll still be seen as black first, individual second. That hasn't changed." "But it should," she said firmly, "after what we've learned here. Progress comes slowly, but it does come." He looked around the room at the integrated gathering. This would have been unimaginable a few months ago. Unimaginable in parts of America, too. The conversation was interrupted by Burgermeister Hoffman calling for attention. He delivered a formal speech thanking the 784th for its service, highlighting the reconstruction projects completed and the peaceful occupation they had maintained. What was notable to those who had lived through the Nazi era was what the speech didn't contain: no racial categorization, no ideological frameworks, simply appreciation for specific actions by specific people. Following the speech, Major Williams responded with equal diplomacy, expressing pride in his unit's conduct and hope for Bückeburg's continued recovery. The formalities complete, the gathering transitioned to music and dancing one final time. As Sergeant Wilson led Margaret onto the dance floor, she asked, "Will you write when you return to America?" The question carried implications beyond simple correspondence. Both understood the barriers that would exist: geographical distance, cultural differences, the complications of a relationship between a black American soldier and a German woman in 1945. "I will," Wilson replied, "though I can't promise what the future holds." "None of us can," she said. 6 months ago I couldn't have imagined dancing with an American soldier, especially not." She stopped herself. "A black one," he finished with the directness that had characterized their relationship. "Yes, and now I cannot imagine never having known you, never having learned how wrong we were." Their conversation reflected the thousands of similar interactions occurring across Germany as occupation forces and civilians navigated the complex human terrain of post-war coexistence. For the segregated black units of the American military, this deployment offered a unique historical moment, exercising authority and receiving respect in Germany that would be denied them upon return to America. On their final evening in Bückeburg, Private Reynolds wrote one last letter from his German deployment. "Tomorrow we leave for our next assignment. The strangest part, Sarah, is that I'm actually sad to go. Here, in the country of our enemy, I've experienced something I rarely felt back home, being judged by my character rather than my color. At least that's how it evolved. The Germans started with worse ideas about us than most folks back home, but they proved more willing to change when presented with evidence. The young women who first thought we had tails ended up bringing us home-baked bread on our final day. I wonder if people can change their minds that quickly in Alabama or Mississippi. I wonder what it would take." On July 2, 1945, the 784th Tank Battalion departed Bückeburg. Along the main street, a crowd gathered to watch their convoy pull out, including Margarete, Helga, and to everyone's surprise, their mother. As Sergeant Wilson passed in the lead vehicle, he saluted the family formally. Frau Schultz, after a moment's hesitation, nodded in acknowledgement, a small gesture but significant from a woman who had once forbidden her daughters from being in the same room with such men. The battalion's departure marked the end of a unique chapter in both American military and German social history, a brief window when the artificial barriers of racial ideology were temporarily suspended, allowing human connections that would have been impossible in either pre-war Germany or many parts of the segregated United States. The story of the 784th in Bückeburg would likely have remained a minor footnote in the massive chronicles of World War II and its aftermath, except for an unexpected epilogue that emerged years later. In 1952, Margaret Schultz, having immigrated to the United States through a student exchange program, completed her master's degree in sociology at Columbia University. Her thesis, titled Propaganda, Deconstruction and Social Integration, a case study from post-war Germany, documented the transformation of racial attitudes in Bückeburg following interaction with Black American troops. Using interviews conducted with townspeople and correspondence with former soldiers, Schultz created one of the earliest academic studies of how direct personal contact could rapidly dismantle even deeply ingrained prejudice. The thesis included excerpts from her correspondence with James Wilson, by then a postal worker in New York and active in early civil rights organizing. Their letters, maintained over 7 years, chronicled parallel struggles: Germany's painful confrontation with its Nazi past and America's halting progress toward racial equality. In one particularly poignant exchange from 1949, Wilson wrote, "The irony doesn't escape me that I helped liberate Germans from Nazi ideology, only to return to a country where I still can't eat in certain restaurants. Sometimes I think about those dances in Bückeburg, how quickly minds changed when people simply saw each other as human. Why is that so difficult here?" Margaret's response reflected her academic perspective. Systems of belief resist change more strongly when they benefit those in power. In Bückeburg, Nazi racial ideology collapsed quickly because its falseness was obvious, and maintaining it offered no advantage under American occupation. In America, racial prejudice persists because it serves economic and social functions for those who hold power. Their correspondence, later donated to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, provided a unique window into the post-war period's racial dynamics from both German and African American perspectives. Helga Schultz's path diverged from her sister's, but proved equally influenced by those months in 1945. After training as a teacher, she dedicated herself to educational reform in West Germany, developing curricula that explicitly addressed Nazi propaganda techniques and their role in enabling atrocities. Her teaching materials, which used the tail myth and its debunking as a case study in critical thinking, reached thousands of German students in the crucial post-war generation. For the men of the 784th Tank Battalion, the Bückeburg experience represented a bittersweet interlude, a glimpse of how life might be in a society that judged them as individuals rather than as a racial category. Many carried this memory through the difficulties of reintegrating into segregated America, finding in it both hope for possible change and heightened awareness of existing injustice. Henry Jackson, the corporal who had danced with Helga, completed his education under the GI Bill and became a history teacher in Philadelphia's public schools. In his classroom hung a photograph of the 784th in Bückeburg, which he used to discuss with students how propaganda can dehumanize and how human connection can overcome manufactured divisions. Marcus Reynolds returned to Detroit and joined the early civil rights movement, often recounting his German experience as evidence that racial attitudes could transform when given the right conditions. "They thought we had tails on Monday," he would tell audiences, "and by Saturday night they were bringing us home to meet their mothers. Change is possible when people actually meet the folks they've been taught to fear." In 1965, during a civil rights march in Alabama, Reynolds encountered unexpected resistance from local residents. Facing angry protesters, he tried an unusual approach, offering to dance with any woman brave enough to test her beliefs. The moment, captured by a news photographer and published nationwide, consciously echoed his experience in Bückeburg 20 years earlier. James Wilson and Margarete Schultz maintained their correspondence until his death in 1972. Though their relationship remained platonic, both married others, their friendship represented a living connection between communities, with parallel journeys of confronting destructive ideologies. The story of Bückeburg's transformation contains no dramatic confrontations, no momentous political declarations, just the cumulative impact of hundreds of human interactions that gradually replaced caricature with reality. In this sense, it offers a case study in how prejudice can dissolve not through force or even persuasion, but through direct experience that contradicts propagandized beliefs. The Dance Hall of Bückeburg in 1945 created a neutral space where young German women who had been taught to see Black Americans as subhuman encountered instead individual men with distinct personalities, skills, and stories. The music provided a structured interaction that allowed connection without requiring immediate ideological recalibration, and chocolate, that simple pleasure, served as a universal language when words failed. For modern historians studying denazification and racial attitude transformation, the Bückeburg case offers a counterintuitive lesson that formal re-education programs often proved less effective than informal social interaction in dismantling deeply held prejudices. The Germans who danced with Black American soldiers experienced a more profound transformation than those who merely attended mandatory lectures on democracy or viewed films documenting concentration camps. This history illuminates a universal truth about prejudice and its antidotes. Dehumanizing propaganda works by creating distance, conceptual, emotional, and physical, between groups. Its power diminishes when that distance is collapsed through direct human encounter, especially in contexts that highlight shared humanity rather than emphasizing difference. In 1960, at a civil rights conference in Atlanta, Marcus Reynolds, by then a community organizer, summarized the lesson of Bückeburg. Propaganda needs isolation to survive. When people actually meet those they've been taught to fear or hate, the myths can't stand up against reality. In Germany, we didn't convince people we didn't have tails through arguments. We showed them by dancing. Sometimes that's more powerful than any speech. The final chapter of this story emerged in 1995, when Helga Schultz, then 66, and a respected educational consultant, organized a reunion in Bückeburg, marking the 50th anniversary of the town's liberation and occupation. Several surviving members of the 784th Tank Battalion, including Henry Jackson, returned to Germany for the event. The gathering included a recreation of the original dance, with elderly participants teaching younger generations the steps they had learned 5 decades earlier. In a symbolic moment that received national coverage in both German and American media, Jackson, now a grandfather of 7, danced with Helga just as they had in 1945. Interviewed by German television, Helga reflected on the long arc of transformation. "We were children of Nazi Germany, raised on terrible lies about human difference. Those young American soldiers could have treated us with contempt after what our country had done. Instead, they showed us dignity, kindness, and chocolate." She smiled at the memory. "They danced with us until we could no longer believe the monstrous myths we had been taught. Sometimes I think all of Germany's post-war redemption began on that dance floor." Jackson, speaking to the same reporter, offered his perspective. Coming to Germany as a black soldier in 1945 was surreal. Back home, I faced segregation and discrimination. Here, I was part of the liberating force, yet initially feared because of even more extreme prejudice. What happened in this town showed how quickly hate can dissolve when people actually meet face to face. The transformation we witnessed here gave me hope for America's future too. The reunion, documented in the German Historical Archive and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, preserved this unique moment of intercultural connection for future generations, studying the human capacity for both terrible prejudice and remarkable transformation. Today, few residents of Bückeburg remember the spring of 1945 firsthand, but the town maintains a small museum exhibition documenting this period, including photographs of those dances and oral histories from participants. Local schools include this story in their curriculum as part of Germany's ongoing commitment to historical memory and education against prejudice. For the families of the 784th Tank Battalion's veterans, this history represents a proud legacy, evidence that their fathers and grandfathers not only served in combat, but participated in the deeper victory of changing hearts and minds through personal example. Many maintain connections with German families that began during those uncertain months of occupation. The story of German women who wondered if black soldiers had tails, only to spend evenings dancing with them, offers more than a curious historical anecdote. It demonstrates how quickly human connections can overcome even the most deeply implanted prejudice when people engage as individuals rather than as categories. It reminds us that transformation often occurs not through grand gestures or formal programs, but through ordinary interactions that reveal shared humanity. As James Wilson wrote to Margarete Schulz in one of their final exchanges, "What happened in Bückeburg wasn't miraculous, it was simply human recognition breaking through artificial barriers. The miracle would be if we could reproduce that recognition everywhere. Prejudice divides people from one another. That recognition, the ability to see beyond propaganda to the individual human being, remains as powerful and necessary today as it was on a dance floor in occupied Germany, where music and movement broke through years of careful indoctrination in a single evening, proving that the most effective weapon against dehumanization is simply the opportunity to experience another's humanity." One of the most remarkable aspects of the Bückeburg story was the rapidity of the transformation. Nazi propaganda had spent years constructing elaborate racial hierarchies, investing tremendous resources in films, literature, and educational materials that depicted black people as subhuman. Yet much of this indoctrination crumbled within days of actual human interaction. This phenomenon puzzled post-war sociologists, including Professor Ernst Keller at Heidelberg University, who interviewed several Bückeburg residents in 1954 as part of his study on denazification. "The propaganda was effective in creating fear and disgust," noted Keller in his findings, but proved remarkably fragile when confronted with contradictory evidence. Particularly among younger Germans, the discrepancy between what they had been told and what they observed created a cognitive dissonance that was resolved not by rejecting the evidence, but by rejecting the propaganda. This pattern repeated across occupied Germany, wherever black American troops were stationed, though rarely with the systematic documentation that eventually emerged from Bückeburg. In Frankfurt, Munich, and Berlin, similar stories unfolded, initial fear and revulsion giving way to curiosity, and eventually normal human interaction. What made the 784th's experience in Bückeburg particularly significant was the deliberate nature of their community engagement. Unlike some occupation units that maintained rigid separation from the local population, the 784th's command had embraced General Davis's philosophy of tacit diplomacy through exemplary conduct. Major Williams, who would later serve in the Pentagon before retiring as a colonel, described this approach in a 1968 Military Journal article. "Our mission wasn't simply occupation, but demonstration. Every interaction with German civilians was an opportunity to contradict years of vicious propaganda. We understood that our conduct would either reinforce or refute what these people had been taught about black Americans. This understanding permeated the unit, creating a sense of purpose beyond military duty. For men who had experienced discrimination in their own country, the opportunity to reshape perceptions held powerful personal significance. As Sergeant Wilson later described in a 1955 interview with the Chicago Defender, "We knew we weren't just representing the Army or even America. We were representing our race, showing people who had been fed nothing but lies what we were really like." The dance initiative proved particularly effective because it created a structured environment for social interaction. The formality of dancing provided clear roles and boundaries, reducing anxiety on both sides, while enabling genuine human connection. Music bridged language barriers, and the physical act of dancing required a level of trust that helped dismantle preconceptions. For the German women of Bückeburg, these interactions challenged not only racial propaganda, but gender expectations within Nazi ideology. Having been taught that their highest purpose was producing racially pure children for the Reich, many had internalized strict boundaries around acceptable social conduct. Dancing with Black American soldiers represented a double transgression, violating both racial taboos and feminine propriety. Ilse Weber, one of the young women who attended the first dance, described this conflict in a 1996 oral history. "My father would have disowned me if he had known. He died on the Eastern Front believing everything Hitler told us, but my mother, who lived to see how wrong it all was, eventually understood that night changed my life. I learned to question not just what I'd been taught about race, but everything the Reich had fed us about proper German womanhood." This gendered dimension of the Bückeburg story added complexity to the transformation. Many of the town's women had lost husbands, fathers, and brothers to the war. Their traditional protectors gone, they faced occupation in a state of vulnerability. The respectful treatment they received from Black American soldiers, men they had been taught to fear most, created a powerful contradiction to Nazi narratives about both race and American intentions. Frau Müller, the mother of 3 daughters who attended the dances, described this realization in a letter to Margaret Schulz, later included in her thesis. "We were told the Americans would ravage our women, especially the colored soldiers. Instead, they brought food for our children and fixed our homes. The lies were so enormous, I began to wonder if anything we had been told was true." This questioning often extended beyond racial ideology to encompass the entire Nazi worldview. As more Germans encountered the fundamental falseness of racial propaganda, other aspects of Nazi indoctrination became suspect. The recognition that they had been systematically misled about one group opened the possibility of broader deception. From the American military perspective, the Bückeburg experience offered unexpected insights into denazification strategies. Captain Miller noted in his unit report, "The formal denazification programs rely heavily on intellectual approaches, lectures, films, directives. Our experience suggests that social interaction produces more profound attitude changes. People resist being told their beliefs are wrong, but revise them naturally when experience contradicts propaganda." This observation influenced later occupation policies, with some military governors incorporating more community engagement initiatives alongside formal re-education programs. While never formally acknowledged in official military history, the Bückeburg model of integration through social interaction became an informal template for civilian relations in several occupation zones. For the soldiers themselves, the Bückeburg experience created a complex set of expectations and disappointments. Having experienced a form of social acceptance in occupied Germany, many found the return to American segregation particularly painful. Private First Class David Turner, who had served with the 784th, expressed this contradiction in a 1947 letter to Helga Schulz. "The hardest part of coming home was remembering how we danced together in Germany, then seeing the colored-only signs back in Georgia. How strange that I was good enough to liberate Germans, but not to sit at a lunch counter with whites in my hometown. Sometimes I think about bringing some of these folks to Bückeburg to show them how quickly people can change when given the chance." This sentiment was common among Black veterans returning from European service, creating a generation of soldiers who had experienced alternatives to American segregation and were increasingly unwilling to accept it. Many historians credit this experience as a contributing factor to the civil rights movement that would gain momentum in the 1950s and 1960s. The correspondence between James Wilson and Margarete Schultz documented this painful transition. In a letter dated November 1945, Wilson wrote, "Being back in New York is strange. Harlem feels both familiar and different. I find myself angry at things I simply accepted before. Yesterday, a white shopkeeper who would have jumped to attention if I wore my uniform in Germany made me wait while he served every white customer first. Before the war, I would have just accepted this as how things are. Now I know it doesn't have to be this way." Margaret's academic analysis provided a framework for understanding these contradictions. In her thesis, she noted, "The German case demonstrates that deeply held prejudices can dissipate rapidly under certain conditions. Authority supporting integration, practical benefits to cooperation, and structured opportunities for equal status contact. When these elements are absent, as in the American South, even extensive contact may not erode racial barriers." This observation anticipated contact theory, which would later become a cornerstone of social psychology's understanding of prejudice reduction. The Buckeberg experience, as documented by Schultz and later researchers, offered one of the earliest natural experiments in how intergroup contact under favorable conditions can transform attitudes. For the town of Buckeberg itself, the legacy of those months in 1945 created a distinctive local identity. Unlike many German communities that preferred to forget the Nazi period entirely, Buckeberg incorporated this episode of transformation into its civic narrative. The small museum exhibition established in 1985 positioned the town not merely as a former Nazi stronghold, but as a case study in human capacity for positive change. Bürgermeister Klaus Müntner, speaking at the 1995 reunion, captured this sentiment. "Our town has a unique place in history, not because we were better than others during the Nazi time, but because we were fortunate to experience a particular kind of liberation." The 784th Tank Battalion showed us our humanity when we had forgotten it. This is not just black history or American history or German history, it is human history. The ripple effects of those dances in the spring of 1945 continued to spread through personal connections long after the war. Helga Schultz maintained correspondence with several veterans of the 784th, eventually visiting Henry Jackson in Philadelphia in 1962, a trip that coincided with early civil rights demonstrations. Her experience observing American racial tensions firsthand deepened her commitment to educational reform in Germany. In a diary entry from that visit, she wrote, "Watching Negro children facing angry crowds to attend a previously white school, I remembered how frightened I was to dance with Henry that first night. Fear of the unknown is the same everywhere, but I learned in one evening what these American children must prove every day, that humanity transcends the artificial boundaries we create." Margaret Schultz's academic career eventually took her to the University of California, Berkeley, where she taught sociology with a focus on propaganda analysis and prejudice reduction. Her work, influenced by her personal experience in Buckeberg, contributed to developing educational programs designed to combat prejudice through structured intergroup contact, an approach that would later be implemented in desegregation efforts across America and anti-racism initiatives globally. The 784th Tank Battalion's veterans, meanwhile, carried their Buckeberg experience into various aspects of American life. Beyond those already mentioned, others made notable contributions. Lieutenant Robert Parrish became a school administrator in Chicago, implementing innovative integration programs based partly on lessons from Germany. Sergeant William Coleman entered politics, eventually serving as a state legislator in New York and citing his occupation service as formative to his understanding of how to build multicultural communities. Corporal Thomas Jefferson founded a dance school in Los Angeles that explicitly welcomed students of all backgrounds, naming one of his signature programs the Buckeberg Method, teaching dance as a vehicle for social connection across cultural divides. The most profound legacy, however, remained at the personal level, individual lives transformed through unexpected human connection. For women like Margarete and Helga Schultz, The experience created a fundamental skepticism toward any ideology that categorized people rather than recognizing individual humanity. For soldiers like Wilson, Jackson, and Reynolds, it offered both a bittersweet memory of respect denied them at home and hope for what America might eventually become. As the participants aged and their direct influence waned, the story might have faded entirely from public memory, except for an unexpected revival of interest in the early 2000s. A German documentary filmmaker, Katharina Weber, granddaughter of one of the original dance participants, produced Dancing with the Enemy, a film that combined historical footage, photographs, and interviews with surviving participants to chronicle the Bückeburg transformation. The film, which won several European documentary awards and was screened at the Smithsonian in 2005, introduced this history to new generations on both sides of the Atlantic. Among its most powerful segments was footage of the 1995 reunion dance, showing elderly Germans and Americans recreating the moment that had transformed their lives half a century earlier. In the film's most quoted moment, Henry Jackson, then 77, reflected, "I've spent 50 years teaching history, telling young people that change is possible. But I never found a better example than what happened here in Bückeburg. We didn't change these people's minds with arguments or force. We changed them by being ourselves, by showing them our humanity through something as simple as a dance." This sentiment captures the enduring significance of the Bückeburg story. In a world still struggling with dehumanization and prejudice, it offers a case study in how direct human connection can overcome even the most systematically implanted hatred. The German women who wondered if black soldiers had tails, only to spend evenings dancing with them, remind us that propaganda's power, though immense, remains vulnerable to the simple reality of shared humanity. As one Bückeburg resident told Margaret Schultz during her research, "The most dangerous idea to any system of hatred is that the other might simply be a person like yourself. Once you know that truth, everything else falls apart." This insight, that humanization is the most effective antidote to dehumanization, remains the lasting legacy of those spring nights in 1945, when music and movement accomplished what military might alone could not: the transformation of hearts and minds through the recognition of common humanity. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.